Good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you all to the Washington State Transportation Commission's AV Workgroup Exec Committee meeting. I'm Jim Restucci, Commissioner from the Washington State Transportation Commission and your chair. Shiv, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Shiv Batra, Vice Chair on the AV Committee.
Markel, could you go ahead and do roll call, please?
Sure thing. Well, we know that Jim and Shiv are here. Senator Joe Wynn. Senator Curtis King. Senator Ann Rivers. Representative Shelley Kloba.
Good morning.
Good morning. Representative Mary Dye. Scott McCoy representing for Chief John Batiste.
I'm here. Hello.
David Fort representing for Mike Kreidler.
I'm here.
Marcus Glasper. Ted Bailey representing for Roger Millar. Debbie Driver. Joel Sachs.
Good afternoon. Allison Drake attending on behalf of Joel Sachs.
Thank you. Caitlin Jekyll representing for Cami Feek. Laura Johnson. Pam Pancock representing for Shelley Baldwin.
Here.
Zach Hudgens representing for Bill Kehoe. Dr. Yinhai Wang. Justin Layton. Bruce Agnew.
Here.
Justin Layton's here, sorry.
Thank you. Greg Spots.
Hi, this is Armand Shabazian attending in place of Director Spots until he's able to attend later on.
Thank you. Kurt Augustine.
I'm here.
Brenda Wiest.
I'm here.
Todd O'Brien. Fernando Mejia Ledesma. Brian Mistely.
Here.
Melanie McAleenan.
I'm present. Thank you.
Bryce Yaden.
I'm here. Thank you.
Ariel Wolf. Steve Gordon. Brent Ludeman representing for Aidan Ollie Sullivan. Anna Zevarts. All right, did I miss anyone?
I'm Markel, Ted Bailey, Washington State DOT, representing Secretary Millar.
Wonderful, thank you.
Markel, did you call up Senator Claudia Kaufman, our newest member from the Senate?
I did not. Thank you for that. Senator Claudia Kaufman.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Chair, we have 16 out of 34 representatives.
Thank you. I do not believe that's a quorum, is it?
Do not believe so.
Okay, well, we can continue to move forward because we don't have any action items right now that I believe. So let's go ahead and Scott, are you there?
I am. Yes, Mr. Chair, I was going to say no voting items today, at least that we're going to introduce to the group. I was just also going to note that I did see a note from Ariel Wolf that he would be here a few minutes late. So just as we think about quorum, I think we're going to have some late joiners that may bring us to quorum if we do have voting items down the line. So,
okay, thank you. All right, well, we'll go ahead and move on. If we do see new members come on, just let me know and I'll go ahead and recognize them. So let's moving on to the second item, which is the 2023 AV Workgroup plans. Scott.
So good afternoon now, everybody. Just really want to talk about kind of where we're headed this year for the final year of the work group. And we're going to spend a fair amount of time today talking about the roadmap, which we've introduced over the last year, focusing on finishing the last two pillars of that and ultimately bringing this back to you later this year. We'll talk about that's going to be really the legacy deliverable for this work group, charting kind of a course into the future for further activities by the state after the sunset of the work group. So obviously, final work group report, those are going to be intertwined together. And from that, just really want to touch on kind of the general expectations for this year from in terms of the executive committee and the subcommittees. We're going to kind of outline here executive committee actions, I think, on the next slide, if you keep moving, Markel. So we'll touch first on the roadmap here. So again, roadmap to the future is going to be this the legacy deliverable really for this group, and really intended to be a resource for lawmakers and stakeholders as you consider future actions with regards to AV readiness. So the intention is to deliver this at the end of the year when the work group sunsets, and it's really a plan for how Washington can continue to prepare for AVs. Centered on these 5 key components. So we've already talked in previous meetings about agency readiness, pilots and testing, and public outreach. Today, we're going to focus on safety and path to deployment as our 2 central areas. Next slide, please. So let's jump in here with a discussion around safety and goals regarding safety, and start with this topic area. So as we think about preparing for AVs in Washington State, safety is a critical element of everything that we do and plan for, and what future decision makers are going to have to consider. Some considerations that go with that, thinking very multimodally about safety, and not only how vehicles engage in the roadway space with other vehicles, but also with motorists, cyclists, pedestrians, transit, other users of the system as well. Regulating AVs and related technologies in terms of collecting data, understanding those testing activities, really ensuring that technologies that are being tested and deployed are safe, and that there's a data basis as we think about that. Creating a fair and transparent permitting system is a really important step forward as we think about testing and further deployment. And how the public visibility into that. So in terms of activities to date from the work group, there are a few key things that have really been done to address AV safety. One is the ADAS survey that was done by the Safety Commission, excuse me, and supported by the Safety Subcommittee. So really furthering development and education plan. The next was the AV Workgroup website, really just expanding visibility into the activities of the group. And finally, in House Bill 2676, Section 2, on AV notifications and reporting, a key step in that direction as well. So from there, we're going to switch over to Mentimeter. So as we've done with these in the past, we want to make sure to get some feedback from you. So bear with me for just a second here. Okay. So hopefully you are able to see that, and the question that we have presented to you here in terms of, are there other activities that we missed, highlighting that the work group has undertaken that we want to make sure to document and capture as part of the overall roadmap documentation. So I'll give you a second. I think you've all been through the drill, but menti.com and the code is on there. Let me know if you have any questions on this. Markel, I may ask for, oh, no, not needed. It's like, I think this will start populating on this slide, but it wasn't 100% sure they changed their format. So just getting in some feedback here. Pavement markings for machine vision, smart work zones. So I think some good feedback in terms of activities and areas that we want to continue to explore. So we're going to obviously dig deeper in this, and I want to make sure that we come back to some of these as well. Thinking here primarily about what are some of the things that we've already accomplished as a group, and making sure that we've kind of captured all of those, reviewed a number of state pilots, and provided feedback on safety. I think that's great addition here. So I think many of these great comments, I'm going to ask you to keep these in your mind as we kind of get to discussion towards the end of this section, and kind of talk about what are some of the other actions and focus areas that we really do need to capture in the roadmap going forward. So we're getting some of those. So considered pilot program to learn about safety needs, agreed, in terms of an opportunity to do that as well. So thank you for this feedback. We're going to capture this going forward. Why don't we go back to our slides here and all right. So looking ahead in terms of safety, I think there's really kind of four broad areas that we wanted to focus on as we kind of think about the safety topic, and what needs to be kind of captured as go forward priorities with regards to safety. So, so policy and agency preparedness to address safety concerns, laws and enforcement, critical engagement there, road user compliance and understanding, and licensing, education and testing, kind of all really the kind of create the fundamentals of addressing safety as we think about AVs. So let's get into some examples there as we think about some of these topics. So, so let's start with policy here. Policy for deployment and AV operations and testing. So thinking about how do we essentially just simply ensure safe technologies are tested and deployed. What are the processes and regulations that need to be in place to do that? Collecting data, monitoring testing efforts as an example, creating a permit system, a permitting system that is clear and transparent to all users as part of that as well. Kind of, potential areas of focus here as we think about policy. So laws and enforcement, thinking about law enforcement and first responders is a key priority here, and with a goal of educating and informing agency procedures. There's clearly a big education effort that has to happen here in terms of how to interact with AVs. So a big priority area, creating interaction plans and protocols for these agencies as a how-to in terms of creating, bridging that gap between law enforcement and AVs on our roadways. Road user compliance and understanding. So just, thinking about all of the different road users that need to understand how to interact with AVs on the roadway, building that understanding of how they operate, how they interact with other road users, setting an expectation of behavior for AVs. And this is really a communications exercise. How do we communicate with the public, with the broad set of roadway users on how to interact with AVs, and what kind of public outreach campaign is needed to really get that information out to the public, kind of important pathways there to bridging that gap. So licensing, driver's license, education and testing, crash analysis reporting, both kind of examples here, and thinking about how do we educate and enhance driver and road user awareness of use of AVs, of the vehicle functionality, and the differences between some of the technologies on the road today that we would consider more ADAS versus more advanced levels of automation as we move down the path and in terms of what's already out there and what's yet to come. So thinking about updating testing criteria and mandates, training law enforcement, what are some of the new needs and areas that are really going to have to be addressed here as we think about more and more people coming into this space and the needs today and from a licensing context. So diversity of input is going to be critical here, and we've already kind of touched on this multiple times. The needs and the safety focus is going to look a little bit different depending on the roadway user. We've got to capture that broad cross section of user, from drivers, cyclists, pedestrians, and transit riders. Also really important to have an equity lens as we're looking at all of these elements in terms of communication, in terms of training, understanding how to interact with these vehicles, and really focusing on a broad cross section of communities, focusing importantly on often less engaged communities to make sure that that we understand their needs and how to communicate across the board to really bridge some of these important gaps. Okay, so we're going to move on now to the next polling question, and this is really an opportunity. I think some of you were eager to jump in on this broader question of what are some of the other areas that we should be focusing on as we think about safety activities regarding AVs. So appreciate some of the feedback on the last slide. I think a lot of that does feed into this, and looking forward to some discussion around some of these items. So give you all a second to chime in, and by all means, if you have anything that you want to specifically bring up and discuss with the group, please raise your hand or come on mic and join in the discussion here. Okay, just waiting for some comments to come in here. We've got compliance with international safety standards. I think it's a great add here. Curb space management. It's another piece to the puzzle. Certainly a hot topic regarding AVs. So engagement with firefighters, real-time messaging about road hazards and changing conditions. I think that's an important area that there's been a lot of focus on. What are some of the opportunities there with messaging and communication with vehicles? Uniform state standards, certainly a key area. So comment here on, should the state conduct an AV pilot so that we can garner our own safety data? So very interesting point there, and I welcome whoever put that on here to kind of join in discussion and expand on that. So just a reminder to this group, we did advance a recommendation regarding a pilot last year that did not get advanced out of here, and I do think there's some opportunity for that. Clearly, that's any kind of a pilot activity is a single very narrow kind of activity relative to broader testing that could be happening and what can be learned from that. But obviously, there's an opportunity to learn from a safety standpoint from any pilot and kind of have that hands-on learning experience for the stakeholders involved. That's really kind of one of the powers behind a potential pilot opportunity, is just that very direct involvement in what's deployed and how it's operating and what have you. So all AV workgroup members should experience a ride in a level 4 or level 3 or 4 AV. I love it. Couldn't agree more. Workforce training and operator safety. So safety requirements for allowing deployment. I think certainly an important area. Anybody want to come on to discuss any of these suggestions that are being thrown out here?
I don't see anyone, Scott. If you
Well,
do want, oh,
maybe I'll
right.
just say one thing here. Bill
Oh.
Perspach, Department of Licensing. I do think I would be curious to continue that conversation about the path to deployment, what that looks like. I think that's a major barrier right now, and being able to take the next step. I was, in Phoenix for a conference, and I rode the Waymo one around Phoenix, the commercial pilot they're operating there. It was just interesting to see, how some states really do have that level of activity, and what, as a state, what would we be comfortable with, right? To take that next step from just testing to more, paying passengers getting rides. I still think that's a big question that's hanging out there, at least in my mind.
So, and before moving on to Representative Kloba, I'll just say next topic for sure. We're going to move on to path to deployment, and not to say that we shouldn't, talk about it here. It's very intertwined with the safety discussion. We actually kind of, even in putting these topics together, had a little bit of trouble separating the two and figuring out where to draw the line, because certainly safety and path to deployment are hugely intertwined here. But we're going to deal with that pillar next. I think talk a little bit more about that. How do we put some structure around that path to deployment? So certainly agree these are very intertwined topics, and happy to start that discussion here as well. So
Thank you, Scott. Representative Kloba, and then Ted Bailey, and then Bryce Yaden.
Yeah, thank you. I am really, I didn't put this one up, but I do want to kind of reemphasize that we don't necessarily have anything that helps us as a state understand how does a company get to the point where they think that this is a safe enough technology to deploy into our communities. There needs to be some amount of maybe not showing your work, but going through and, checking off on, the various criteria that your system has met before we can let it out. I mean, right now there is no particular set of criteria that you have to meet. And I think that that's an issue.
Yeah, agreed. And I think we're gonna touch on that more in the path to deployment, but I think your point is spot on in terms of creating a framework around what are those criteria? What does that look like? How does the state get a comfort level on moving forward with a particular technology? That is the essential question around path to deployment, certainly.
I guess Chair Stucci, is okay if I jump in? I'll say
By all
most of my
means.
remarks for the path to deployment conversation but I'd be remiss if I didn't share. The only barrier to deployment in our state is the lack of clarity in the process. You could deploy at scale right now and charge people, and our process allows it. It's just not clear enough for industry to have confidence in it. And then the other piece is right, the federal government, NHTSA has decided to enforce safety through its recall authority. And so at the state level, if we're going to follow what Seattle is doing and have a permit program and be more hands-on, well, that's well and good. And I know Ariel will probably have some comments on that. But if we do that, we have to invest relatively significantly in expertise. And so I think that's the part that we have to decide. If we want to invest at our current level, then we will manage on I'll call it the back end, where NHTSA is at. You wait for something to happen and you decide what to do then, and you keep an eye on things. And so I'm excited for the path to deployment conversation. Sounds like that's later on in the agenda.
Bryce.
This is Bryce. Appreciate the presentation. I think I'm trying to struggle to put into words exactly what I'm thinking, but it sounded pretty close to what Representative Klova was mentioning, which is, when we were talking about safety in the previous slide, it was the direction of what is the expectations of road users outside of the AV to recognize what their actions might be, and what the expectations of us are as other road users, as pedestrians or otherwise. And I wonder, kind of building on what Representative Klova said, is what is the state's expectations for AVs for safety? What do we want to see in a responsible network or a responsible user of our roadway? And I don't want to, dive into the other, interconnected areas such as, liability, but it also connects to liability. If an individual driving a vehicle, there's multiple liability requirements depending on what decision you make in an awful situation. And, I just don't know if we have those in place and an understanding of what the outcomes are related to safety breaches, or the data collection related to AVs breaking regulations or rules, or who has access to that data. How do we make sure the state can collect that and understand it if an AV is speeding or otherwise? Again, I think there's great opportunity. I just think we need some clarity around what are the safety expectations of the AVs at this point, as it relates to the interactions with others and road use loss.
Thank you, Bryce. Armand.
Thank you, Chair. This is Armand Shabazian from the Seattle Department of Transportation. I just wanted to also reemphasize that each city's transportation environment is hyper-localized and vastly different, and we have to keep that in mind when considering statewide approaches to mobility technology to make sure that we're accounting for each unique transportation environment. So AVs might be very successful in Phoenix, where the roads are very wide, there's limited hills, the weather is relatively mild, but we have to be considerate of the unique and localized environments that AVs will arrive in, and then also consider how the technology is going to integrate with the other transportation modes that might be present in a city to make sure that we're providing the highest quality service for users. So just wanted to throw that out there, and not to get ahead of our presentation that will follow.
Thank you very much.
Good tee
I
up
don't
for
see
that.
any more questions right now. So Scott, you can go ahead. Ariel.
Hi there, and apologies for the background noise. Hopefully I'm coming through okay. Let me know if not. So I joined a couple minutes late and just trying to work it with my schedule. So again, apologies if this was covered. I'll say a very quick note here, and then I know there'll be open time later on. I'll just plant the flag on the issue of, when we have a perspective on behalf of the Autonomous Vehicle Industry Association, being able to look across the country in a number of different issues. And I'll just say, all of these issues and matters are important, but they're not that complicated. And other states and jurisdictions have found ways to move forward. And I'll just note that we are at an inflection point in this technology. We have, as I'm sure folks know, in San Francisco and in other cities, in Phoenix and in Texas, we have a passenger ride hail service that's being deployed, and it's becoming at scale. And there are other deployments happening. I would just, make a point here at the outset that, we seem to be at a crossroads with this work group and with Washington State in general, and that is to really lean in hard and find answers to these questions and get to a path to deployment and actually enact that, as was attempted earlier this year. Or, and I just want to be very clear, now that we're sort of winding down this group this year, or it's going to be a situation where the technology providers and the operators are going to look into other places. And I think that's what we have to be reckoning with here. We can talk about a lot of these issues repeatedly and at great length, whether it's liability or data and so forth. But the reality is other places have figured this out. There's a path forward, it can be done, and it is being done. And I would just really urge this group and anyone interested in bringing this technology at scale to Washington to take that to heart. Thanks.
Thank you, Bryce. Representative Kloba.
Yeah, so in terms of, for instance, I think there was a mention just a moment ago from Mr. Wolf about legislation that we had last session. And so that notion of assigning liability in a crash situation to a non-human entity, is that the gist of what you'd like to move forward, or were there other things? That was the main piece of legislation I was thinking of last year or last session. And, have other states done it that way?
I'm happy to respond. Apologies, I can't see the screen. So,
by all means.
Thank you, Representative. Thank you for the point. I'm referring to the deployment legislation, and I think it's a very important point on liability, which is something that's come up a number of times in other places. I think the thing that I would just note on that issue, and I know I don't want to get sidetracked, but I'm happy to discuss it further as the meeting goes on or in a different context. That maybe one point would be that we've been accommodating and incorporating new technologies into the automotive fleet, into vehicles for many decades. And so there is an aspect here that, yes, it should be thought of, it should be reckoned with, but ultimately the common law and precedent has been a way of addressing that. And I would just maybe as a corollary to that, note that NHTSA is currently proceeding with the rulemaking on automatic emergency braking, pedestrian automatic emergency braking. And it's my understanding that states are not looking to adopt a similar kind of approach and try and reckon with liability questions. This is technology that applies a braking force to a vehicle based on sensory input and detection. Now, it's not the same as autonomy. We've certainly been clear about that, the difference between driver assist and autonomous vehicles. But just note that there are liability questions with all of these new technologies as they come on board, any kind of a crash avoidance type approach. And so, again, I think these are important questions to raise, but I don't think they should act as what I think has become an impediment to a path to deployment, which, as I noted, acts as ultimately an impediment to Washington being a leader and seeing this technology bring the benefits. And that's what's lost, I think, ultimately the whole conversation is there are significant benefits the data is showing to having autonomous vehicles out. Crashes are reduced. We don't see significant or severe injuries coming in. And so that's the part of the conversation I just want to reflect. So appreciate it.
Hey, other questions or comments, or Representative Klober, are you still? Okay. Okay, Scott, I think we can move on.
Well, so I think, thank you for that discussion. I think we're gonna probably continue it immediately hereafter. I'm gonna pull up our next round of slides here, Mr. Chair, just to jump into the path to deployment discussion. So, you know, I mentioned previously, bear with me one second. That this was really, it's very intertwined with the safety pillar. And I think it was sort of hard to delineate as we put these together. I think we've touched on a lot of the concepts here. I'll skip kind of the preamble. We've already talked about that. But, you know, path to deployment is really about safety in and of itself is an important thing. The question in path to deployment is what is the threshold, what is the barrier on safety? And just as an example, you know, that really has to be crossed to allow that path to deployment. How does Washington want to look at that? And I think we've already touched on a kind of a number of different ways and you know, considerations in terms of what other states have done. But you know, bottom line, just the need to provide clear expectations of the regulatory agencies, so that those looking to deploy know what is expressly allowed and what isn't, and what the bar is that must be crossed to be able to deploy. Clearly, that needs to be done with a lens towards safety, but finding that balance in a way that doesn't limit opportunities for innovation, and really just focusing on that state's role, without preempting or without you know, trying to get ahead of or get out of alignment with, you know, perhaps what may be done at the federal level as well, is another consideration kind of go forward as we think about path to deployment. So again, I want to start with just from the standpoint of as we build this roadmap and really build the narrative around what this group has already done towards path to deployment. I think a number of activities, including a couple bills that were passed in the state around umbrella insurance requirements, AV notifications, defining some definitions work around level 4 and 5, and repealing the TV viewer ban. Those were activities that have been completed already, that certainly kind of feed into this path to deployment. And there have been a couple attempted bills as well, one of which that we were just talking more about. So law enforcement and first responder interaction guide being one, and rulemaking authority another one. So there have been activities on this front. And forgive me here as I kind of switch screens and we think about the next round of questions. So we're gonna switch back to Mentimeter here. I want to go back to our question of what did we miss in that discussion? What other activities have been done to date by the work group as we think about path to deployment? Is there anything else that we haven't really covered that has been done or you know, discussed, attempted, that we think feeds the path to deployment discussion, just so that we are able to capture that as we think about just documenting the work group activities at its sunset here. So hopefully you are seeing my screen again here. To go back to Mentimeter, I'll just give everybody a minute to join on and fill in anything that we may have missed as you think about that question. see people joining here, so just giving a little bit more time. All right, nothing popping in yet. Is there anything that anybody wants to jump in on? Comments or items that anybody wants to share? All right, well, let's move on then and keep going on this topic.
I'm happy to jump in, and then I also
Oh, sure.
Looks like you had a different Mentimeter code as well. I noticed that because I typed some stuff in and it didn't go through. That might have impacted others.
Oh, okay.
So I'll throw out there what I put in the chat. So we've had some discussion with the industry representatives down the road of how do you maintain light touch while protecting organizations like WashDOT that have unlimited tort exposure. And so one of the concepts that could be explored further would be expanding the $5 million umbrella coverage, not just to the traveling public, which it covers now, but also to the roadway owner operator. So think of like 5 and 5. That way, if something happens in our current light touch approach on I-5, then there is a mitigation path to recover some of those losses, if indeed through joint several liability, an organization like the DOT was left with part of that liability just because we're the owner operator of the roadway. So that's a discussion topic on the liability path that could be explored further.
Great, thanks for that, Ted. Yeah, and apologies, this is a different Menti code, so sorry for the switch there. Had this in a separate presentation. Anything else anybody wanted to share before we move on? Representative Kloba.
Yeah, thank you. Just this is a subset of, I think, what Ted was just talking about with regard to having liability, and that $5 million is currently on a requirement for AV operators. And it's come to my attention that they're not all, what do I want to say, profitable at this point. And that is a typical sort of pathway of new technology. It takes a little while before it is profitable. So there's this isn't any disparaging kind of comment, but I think within that $5 million of liability, we do allow companies to self-insure. And I think that a subset should be that they're not allowed to self-insure if they are not currently profitable, because I think that's something we hadn't paid attention to when the original idea came forward and legislation was passed. And I think that that's a detail that we need to revisit.
Thank you, Representative Kloba. Zach.
Hi, so I put that answer up there. Our work group initially started talking to folks in the public sector, local jurisdictions that collect data or have a lot of data, and what kind of data could they share with the private sector? And then what kinds of data does the private sector maybe have or would like to have that they could share with the public sector? So what does that data sharing look like? What do those relationships look like? What do those standards maybe look like? So I think if we had a good relationship, then that can help deploy the technology.
Thank you for your comment.
Okay, why don't we, seeing no more hands here, let me switch back and continue our discussion here. So again, kind of considering what are some of the key areas that we really see needing to be addressed as we think about path to deployment going forward, that the roadmap needs to capture. So regulatory changes certainly to transition from testing to deployment as we think about that. Revising the RCW to accommodate some of the advancing technologies, kind of evaluating risk tolerance and standards. I think this really gets to perhaps different scenarios of what can be allowed in what contexts as kind of an important measure or an important bar that we cross as we think about deployment, and identifying areas of overlap or preemption with other regulatory bodies, and kind of streamlining around that. So we think of those as kind of the broad bins that need to be addressed as we think about path to deployment. So let's just jump into a few of those and talk about regulation. I think this is an important area to start that we've already been talking about. Bo, I see your hand up. I don't know if you want to jump in before we continue down that.
Well, I mean, I don't want to steal the thunder, Scott, or if you have kind of I don't know the right time is. I mean, I do have some thoughts. I'd love to share them, but if you want to kind of get through your thing first, I can hold off. I don't want to.
Well, I think this was really the frame up of the core question that you were already addressing in terms of really understanding what are the revising the regulation around deployment expectations and requirements. How do we define specifically the bar that has to be crossed to be able to deploy on roadways? So I think this was really kind of teeing up the discussion. So if that's where your head is still at, by all means, jump back in on this topic.
Okay, yeah, it is right on. So I guess one thing I've been curious about, and I would love to discuss the industry bill at some point, during this session that was introduced, and we had some consideration of the legislature did. But one thing, and maybe David can weigh in on this, but I'd be curious to hear, insurance commissioner's office thoughts on like the insurance. If they feel, the 5 million is good for deployment, if they've thought about that at all, if they have recommendations, leave it, do something different. Because that was one that there was some discussion on, during session. And I don't know, David, I don't mean to put you on the spot. No worries if you haven't gotten there, but do you have any thoughts about, does the deployment environment change at all how we think about these things from an insurance perspective?
Sure, no problem, Bo. So, it's good to remember that $5 million in liability coverage doesn't cost $5 million. It's a small fraction of that. So when we were working with that language back in whenever it was 2020, we looked at other states, and the $5 million in liability isn't, well, let me say that there are many other states that have that amount as well. And we opted to go with that because it's it's a new technology, and we thought that was the good amount to recommend. So do we think it's an inhibitor? I have not heard any company quote to us what their price is for that type of extra coverage. If you have heard from a company saying that's a blocker, we would like to hear about it. And then how much they're paying for it.
Yeah, and I guess, and I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, if I'm monopolizing too much, please shoot me a chat or just mute me. But I guess, and specifically, David, I'd be curious for your thoughts. And of course, Ariel as well. We'd love to hear the industry perspective on, as you move to the path to deployment, more vehicles on the road for each company, right? Assuming they follow kind of the model we've seen in California and Arizona. Does the 5 million, does that sort of cover the expanded number of vehicles, or do you need to adjust that? I mean, can you just, some of us who just aren't familiar with insurance as much, I think maybe to hear.
So, Bo, most of the time, coverage is allotted per occurrence. So most policies would cover the $5 million for the crash. And if you have multiple crashes, it would be 5 million per crash.
And so as I understand it, then it's scale, if you're gonna move to deployment and you still have the $5 million policy, that policy might get more expensive when now you're saying you got 50 vehicles on the road versus 5 for testing. Is that right, or am I thinking about that wrong?
So the price would probably go up the more that exposure there is. Although if the risk is going down, that would affect price as well. So I'm not sure if the AV insurance market has enough data to price it accordingly. We would have to see what those policies are looking like. But you have a couple things happening. You have frequency of loss, and then you have severity of loss. And those two components play into how much claim activity is happening. And then that's how insurance companies will determine rates is based on historic claim experiences. So theoretically, if you have more cars that are under the policy that are on the road, you have more exposure because you have more vehicles on the road. If the technology is being more and more proven to be safe, therefore less claims, then you would expect the rate to go down.
Great discussion, important points. I think we all recognize the importance of this theme, overall in terms of path forward. And that's, really what has been driving the discussion today. So we're going to cover a couple more areas, and then I want to drive back into some dialogue and some polling as well. So if there's nothing else on that one. A few other areas beyond the broad kind of consideration of, just thresholds for being able to deploy. We see some other areas as well that likely have to be addressed in terms of truck platooning as an example, and the following too closely kind of regulations in the RCW as an example area that would likely be addressed going down the line. Requirements for presence of a human driver in the vehicle. This is another important one that needs to be considered, that can really have a role on that, the deployment and kind of just the risk tolerance as we think about what is the intention of the operation of the vehicle. Is it intended to operate without a human operator or a safety operator in the vehicle? Getting clarification around that. Just understanding and creating risk profiles, and kind of all these pieces feed into that as we think about deployment scenarios. The context of where the vehicles are intended to deploy, the types of streets, the speeds that they're intended to operate, kind of what do the operating scenarios look like, and understanding and creating risk profiles around those as we think about allowing deployments. And then again, just understanding how what Washington State is doing dovetails with areas of federal action on this as well, just to make sure that there's not preemptions, that there's not overlapping regulations, but that there's a streamlined approach to this that works for the state and does not conflict with federal guidance on this as well. So with that, let's switch back to Mentimeter. I'm really anxious to see kind of the feedback around this and jump back into discussion here as we think about this question. What else should Washington State be doing? Or let's expand on some of those areas as we think about what does that bar look like? How would we measure that? What does need to be measured versus how kind of self-policing is the system, that's already been created. Kind of all of those questions, I think, come to the table here as we think about what else the state should be doing to facilitate path to deployment. Just give a minute here for some input, and again, just open it up to questions if anybody wants to throw a hand up as well, or comments. So legislative caucus around AVs leading us off, and clearly I think there's a lot of merit to taking that deep dive to really be able to advance something that's covering a lot of these critical areas. Revisiting a pilot program. And I think that's, we talked a lot about a pilot being an opportunity to inform some of this policy. Again, something we put forward last year that did not get picked up, but I think recognizing the importance of that is great. Parking and curbside management, critical to cities as we think longer term here, no question. Affordability, integration with other modes. Any other discussion around this?
Well, Scott, if I can just chime in for a second.
Oh, yeah.
I just say, and thanks, Mr. Chair. I just say if we could just try to come to some agreement on, or maybe what the regulatory structure should look like, between the different players. I think that might be helpful. Obviously, there was quite a bit of disagreement, I think, on the bill from last session, and it would just be interesting to see, if there's space there for compromise on something, or if just where that's at.
Other comments?
Scott, that last one there, the state legislature needs to authorize commercial deployment just like other states have done. That might be something we can talk about. What does that take?
Anybody want to chime in on thoughts there? I think that's kind of central to the discussion here. How high is the bar? What does that bar look like? And I know that's been a challenging question to all get kind of consensus around, but I think that's kind of fundamental to that comment, seems to me.
If I can chime in,
By all means.
certainly the legislature needs to authorize commercial deployment, but we have just been talking in this last, I don't know, however long we've been on, about all the things that need to be in place before commercial development. So I agree that we need to talk about it, but I believe that we have in so many different ways.
Yes, Ted.
Probably too much of a squeaky wheel on this topic, but I'd just be remiss if I didn't say we are resourced as administrative agencies to follow, not to lead, not to engage. And so most of the things we keep talking about are what you do when you have invested. And so by our demonstrated actions, we are in a light touch trust environment, and with not really a way to get off of that train without investment or a specific direction to invest, which is an unfunded mandate, which is very popular, right? Can
you, Ted, elaborate on the investment comment in this case?
I mean, if you were to look at, I mean, it's dedicated staff, it's funding for pilots, it's if you're going to authorize commercial deployments, like California, for example, or I think Pennsylvania does that as well. They have many people that are focused on that to grow the expertise to a level of sophistication to where you are candidly capable of actually doing that well. And so otherwise we wait or in a position where we need to wait for others to basically develop a roadmap that is acceptable to industry, regardless of the size of your economy, California, and then follow, as in, I don't want to say flat out copy, but almost. And so that's the path that we have been on. And despite our levels of creativity, we're there. And so that's where I'm just hopeful that whatever it is that we do going forward, that conscious choice is made, which will make it easier for administrative agencies, many of us who have been leading or attempting to bring our subcommittees off of the bench. The Infrastructure and System Subcommittee hasn't met for 3 years because of resourcing. There isn't something to do. And the things that we've already invested in or shared that we should invest in have not been funded. So let's demonstrate to the folks in the process that we can take the recommendations that are already on the table and start to move those forward with a modest level of investment, and that will lead to I would say more robust conversations that will fine tune exactly what we should be doing. So I'll stop there.
No worries, Ted. Thank you for your comments. Other questions, comments? Yes, Bo.
Yeah, I guess, I'd say from my perspective, I think there's certain elements of what a deployment regulatory regime looks like that I think most of us agree on, like the law enforcement interaction plan. It seems like almost all states have a form of that. I've really never heard anyone, raise concerns about that. It seems like there's pretty much universal acceptance. Many states have some form of insurance. As David mentioned, the 5 million seemed fairly common, at least from the review of other states that I've done, some level of insurance. I think, when you get into self-certification versus review and approved, I think you do start to see some differences of like more the California approach versus the Arizona and some of the others. And so I guess, from my perspective, it's like trying to zero in on those things where we're still, there seems to be a lack of, consensus, and certainly there's issues as well about local preemption that I know have been raised. But that's, I think, where I'd be curious to hear from other folks in the industry about what you see as sort of the major things where we're not on the same page, because it's frustrating to have the bill get introduced with not much notice, right? Where we can talk about it and try to work towards, compromises on some of these issues.
Gotcha, Bo. Okay. Ted.
I just wanted to follow up on my colleague Bo's comment about law enforcement interaction plan. Yes, states do require that. It's one thing to require it. It's another thing to understand if and quote unquote certify that what they have provided is sufficient. If you dig into what other states that are more hands-on are actually doing, it's still a more hands-on self-certification process where you still are putting a significant amount of trust in well, they provided something and nobody said anything, so I guess we're good until proven otherwise. And so, it's still, because getting to a point where you are literally approving something means that you are accepting liability in some way, shape, or form in a joint and several liability states, which is why we have stayed away from that. Then you have to be willing to hold that part all the way through. And so that's the part where, again, we need to explore what are folks that are actually requiring those things really doing with the documents. They're requiring information to be submitted, right? But is anybody reviewing it? And if they review it, are they reviewing it and taking action? Or is it just that it's a false sense of security to say, give us your data, and so we feel good that we've received it? But if an administrative agency isn't resourced to do something with it and then take action in some way, shape, or form, then it falls into the false sense of security category, in my mind.
Thank you, Ted. Armand.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I also just wanted to reiterate that autonomous vehicles are not an abstract object. We'll see them arrive in cities, and we need to be able to set up a mechanism for cities to have a seat at the table to also uplift the experiences of what happens when autonomous vehicles are deployed in larger numbers. Otherwise, we're going to end up in the situation that we've seen in other markets with larger and more sustained AV deployment, where the city has no real mechanism or pathway to uplift what they're seeing on the ground and what their residents and visitors are experiencing. And so I want to reiterate that, yes, there needs to be a statewide framework, but it also needs to be inclusive of the experiences of where these vehicles are actually operating, which is within cities.
Thank you, Armand. Ted, oh, I'm sorry, actually, Ariel, right? Yeah, Ariel.
Thanks so much. Just a couple of quick responses, and let me know again if you have any trouble hearing me. The first is in response to the idea of legislation being put forward without notice. Just make a quick flag there. The legislation, in not just in large part, but really almost entirely, has been a version that's been out for 5-6 years, and it's been enacted into probably about 18 or 19 states in some form or fashion. It's certainly, and it's been, as I recall, maybe in years past, at some point provided to this work group in the committee. So it certainly has been socialized. Maybe it hasn't had the fullest vetting that it possibly could have had, a dedicated meeting of some kind, but it absolutely conceptually is the bedrock foundation for deployment legislation across the country, and has been for about 5 years. That's a kind of a first point. So I think probably picking up on how I am approaching this, I think there is a corresponding somewhat sense of frustration on the industry's part, that there was a sense that this legislation was unvetted. But the second point is just getting at kind of what Ted was talking about, and a couple of other points. Let's take a step back, and I think it's worth the reminder that there is federal jurisdiction in this area, and it's not silent. They're not abdicating anything. There's many different ways that the federal government is involved here, whether it's through the SGO, or now that we've seen multiple recalls that they've issued for AV technology. This is not a silent space, and that's a system we have in the country to avoid having states go in and put in design mandates in different ways, and we'd have 50 different vehicle design requirements that would really just upend or really end the auto manufacturing system we have in the country. So we need to understand and remember that that's the backdrop here. When we're talking about deployment legislation, what is the lane for Washington State to operate in? As I noted before, many important issues that touch on safety and road safety, and that's critical to the conversation. But when you start talking about collecting data, for what purpose? To understand the safety of the technology, that is the domain of the federal government, design, construction, and performance of this technology. And I'll just reiterate what I said before, which is we wouldn't want other technological advancements outside of autonomous vehicles to be the subject of various states doing similar things. It would be very disruptive and impossible to have vehicles designed in such a way. So we have to remember that, and I just reiterated, and happy to talk further as other topics come up.
Thank you, Ariel. Bryce?
Yeah, I just think that Bo had a good point, that maybe it was vetted in other areas. And I'm speaking from somebody who works in Olympia. I don't work in any other state. And I don't know if this is necessary. I don't think we need to take this as a negative. I think we just really need, if we want to get something done, there's a bunch of organizations that work in this area that don't have the same necessarily, reach that people who work in 20 other states do, or we have different concerns for cities or constituencies that maybe aren't as prioritized in other states. So I don't think that Bo was trying to knock anybody. I think that he's giving you a good outline of how this could work better if we're actually functioning together instead of saying that we'll take care of it. So I think that's part of the reason why we're here, is to figure out what areas can we agree on and which areas should there be more one-on-one or larger conversations that perhaps are outside of this. So I don't know. I don't care what. I'm glad that other states are doing it, but since I'm not working there, I don't know how they vetted it.
Thank you, Bryce. Bo?
Yeah, thanks for that, Bryce. I guess, Ariel, I just say, like, having worked on many different pieces of legislation with a lot of different stakeholders over the years, pointing to model legislation and then just dropping a bill without any like prior stakeholdering within Washington, it's completely different. And I do think if the industry really does want to get a bill through, I just don't even think it doesn't need to be a crazy amount of heads up, but at least seeing the actual language you're thinking of introducing with some reasonable amount of time to provide feedback, I think it would be helpful just to try to get the issues talked through. And I don't feel like that happened. I'm sorry with, what happened before, at least not in a way that was sufficient. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you, Bo. Ted? And folks, we're gonna let Ted speak and then we're gonna move on because we have Seattle Department of Transportation is gonna give us a presentation. If we want to revisit this after that presentation, more than happy to let the meeting run longer for that.
Thank you, Chair Stucci. I'll keep this short. I put my comment on the screen there, the bottom left. I had quite the long conversation with NHTSA, and this is to build on what Ariel Wolf was talking about, that we have the authority, according to the NHTSA safety representative that I talked to in Washington State, to regulate the human driver, not the machine driver, which means that we can require a human operator to be in the vehicle, or we could require a remote operator of a driverless vehicle. And that is where our authority ends. And so as I talk with California, the way that they wrote their legislation is that if NHTSA provides more clarity in the future and becomes more hands-on, then that gray area where it may look like California is regulating the machine-driven vehicle, not the human operator, that's where the federal requirements take precedence and that goes away. I'll stop there. I think it's an area that needs more explanation so that we don't try to do something that we don't have the authority to do at the state level.
Thank you, Ted. Appreciate it. I appreciate the conversation, folks. This is really good discussion and we will revisit it. However, right now, we're going to hear from the Seattle Department of Transportation Autonomous Vehicle Program and Mobility updates. We have Greg Spots, Director of Seattle Department of Transportation, and Armand Shabazian. Did I say that right, Armand? Okay.
Yeah, it was great.
Electric and Automated Mobility Policy Advisor. Gentlemen, you have the floor.
Well, thank you so much. Can you all see and hear me right now?
Yes, sir, we can. Thank you.
Great. Greetings, everybody. I'm Greg Spots, Director of Seattle Department of Transportation, and I'm pleased to be joined by Armand, who's really a emerging leader in this space. And Armand and his team have been doing a great job on this work and helping me, further develop my understanding of this emerging area. I wanted to introduce myself a little bit and introduce our safety emphasis at SDOT and our engagement in this space. And then halfway through the PowerPoint, I'll pass it to Armand to get into some more of the detail. Armand, are you driving the PowerPoint?
I can. I thought the work group was going to, but let me throw it up really quick.
Oh, I mean, whoever is doing it.
All right. Hopefully you can all see that.
Ah, there we go.
We can.
Okay. So let me just mention a few thoughts about myself before I get into this deck. I was the executive officer of Streets LA in Los Angeles until last September when I moved up here to become Mayor Bruce Harrell's director of the Department of Transportation. Maybe we can go back to 2 slides before and then I'll work through all this. And when I joined the agency, I embraced our existing vision, mission, and values. Our core values are equity, safety, mobility, sustainability, livability, and excellence. And I decided to further define excellence. In my view, an excellent public agency is responsive, innovative, transparent, and accountable. And we're looking to be guided by those 4 things in the way that we engage with this very exciting emerging area of autonomous vehicles. Next slide, please. So today we're going to talk a little bit about how I entered the job with a lot of community outreach and decided to really make a safety focus. what we're doing with Vision Zero. Some really exciting technology related grants that we've gotten that are adjacent to the AV space. And then Armand will tell us more about what we've been doing in permitting autonomous vehicle testing. I actually live in South Lake Union, which is a core area where Zoox is testing. Zoox is owned by Amazon, and I live right in the middle of the Amazon campus, basically. And so I see these, I think it's a Toyota Highlander with a whole complex rig of different sensors and cameras around the roof in my neighborhood almost every day. So I'm actually observing it even as I'm in charge of the agency that's permitting that activity right now. Okay, next slide, please. So, in Los Angeles, I worked for the city of Los Angeles for 14 years, and Los Angeles has 99 official neighborhood councils, and I'd worked in every one of those registered neighborhoods. And in moving to Seattle, I thought, how do I ramp up on really understanding the community? So last August, I opened up a web link where Seattleites could make me an offer to take me on a walk, bike ride, or transit ride in their neighborhood. And we had more than 200 applications, and I've already implemented more than 100 of these community walks. Most of my weekdays, I start out in the streets with community members. I've done about 2 million steps since I've been a Seattleite, about 11,000 a month in each of the last 9 months. And it's really been amazing getting out there and really meeting the people and walking the streets and learning what works and what needs improvement. Next slide. One of the things that was apparent to me, though, before I even started, was that we needed a rethink on our Vision Zero safety program. I remember reading a presentation that the agency gave last May, a year ago, to the Transportation Committee of the Seattle City Council. And it had a graph showing that, the number of killed and seriously injured on Seattle streets is going up, not down. And I felt like, if you're doing a lot of smart industry standard things to drive an outcome, but the outcome's going in the wrong direction, then you have to develop a hypothesis as to why and what you might do differently. So on my very first day on the job, September 7th, I commissioned a top to bottom review of Vision Zero that was conducted by a few internal staff who don't work on the Vision Zero program here at SDOT. And we received and published that a draft of that review in February and launched 5 early momentum actions that we were going to start implementing this year. At the same time as we announced that, we found out that we won a $25 million federal grant from U.S. Department of Transportation for safer streets. And that's really exciting. That will allow us to do more than 100 safety projects focused on pedestrians and cyclists. And 90% of those are in underserved communities. So one of our 5 early momentum actions is a no right on red zone in the downtown. We just completed putting up signs at 41 signalized intersections in downtown with no turn on red, with the idea of having the most pedestrian friendly downtown in time for the Major League Baseball All-Star game, which is coming next month. So it's really exciting to be able to do that early. And an interesting thing about AVs, right, is, potentially with data interchange, AVs could be very responsive to changes in how we choose to operate our road system. And AVs could actually potentially become better at following speed limit changes or turning changes or other changes than the humans out there. And that's something that intrigues us. Okay, next slide, please. So we've just received 2 very exciting grants involving technology and safety. We got one to help us further develop something we've been piloting where, smart cameras are actually able to understand what's happening in the roadway in real time. And so we have some of that going on near University of Washington, but we're going to deploy it in the South Seattle, one of our underserved communities, and near some of our at-grade light rail stations to better understand all the different movements that are going on between pedestrians, cyclists, cars turning, the light rail passing through. And we're really intrigued about how we might be able to adjust signal timing and other kinds of operation of the street network based on this real-time information and the insights that are developed. And it's very exciting to think that we might be able to transmit some of these insights to autonomous vehicles using something like a V2X exchange. Okay, next slide, please. The other smart grant we got involves sort of digitizing, and the ability to understand how the curb is being used. Code the curb is a very exciting thing where you digitize what are the regulations around each piece of curb space that you have. Once it's digitized, then you start trying to figure out what can I do with that information. And if you have sensors, you could actually understand when loading zones are available. And a very interesting thing potentially about AVs, when you think about AVs making food deliveries or parcel deliveries, what if an AV was much more responsive than a person might be to the idea that there's a place to park that just opened up? People are not really used to the idea of, well, we want you to park in this place. Like at this particular moment, this place is where we want you to park to unload your goods, and might even be resistant to that. But interestingly, like an AV might be able to just slot right into that spot. And something I'm really intrigued by that I wanted to mention is the idea of right size, then electrify, which is the idea of like, before we just go electrify something and deliver it in the same way, are we using the right vehicle? For example, something that I think is a bit odd in Santa Monica, they have a zero emissions delivery zone pilot, which is really interesting. But they have like, Hyundai Ioniq 5 SUVs delivering 5 pounds of like chicken kebabs. And I'm not sure that really makes sense, even if it's an electric vehicle. Is it really worth moving 5,000 pounds of mass to deliver this tiny thing? So I'm also intrigued by the idea of, could there be smaller autonomous vehicles that make food delivery rather than just thinking, oh, we used to do it by car because that's how humans got around. And since there's no human, we still need a car. Next slide, please. So it's really neat that we've partnered with the city of Bellevue to publish a strategic vision for automated vehicles. I'm really proud of both cities for collaborating on this. I'm a passionate believer that cities have a very important role to play in the deployment of AVs, that cities are different than suburbs or outlying areas. And in fact, I do want to take issue with one comment that was made earlier, like, for what purpose would cities be collecting data? Well, the modern city Department of Transportation breathes data in and out every day, collecting data from sensors on the roadway, collecting data from our scooter and bike share vendors, collecting data about like how the light rail is performing and where the buses are. I mean, there's so much data, and we're using that data in real time or near real time to like operate the road system in the safest possible way. So I actually did think it was a little odd asking, well, why would a local DOT need data? Because we actually data drives our entire business. And ultimately, it's our job to operate the road system. I was in San Francisco last week, and local transportation officials don't feel that commercial deployment is a success, in the sense that they're not able to resolve issues in the public right of way that result from malfunctions of AVs. Because it's the one form of mobility that they're not involved in like regulating or managing. So I really do think there's an important role for cities as this rolls out. Next, please. So there's some regional goals also that have been adopted, and many of these were mentioned in the discussion in the last hour. And certainly, I think, we have to keep lifting up equity. I think a really interesting question about battery electric vehicles is, just like, rooftop solar, battery electric vehicles have basically been a luxury good for the privileged. And that was true for solar power before that, at least residential solar. So, how do we get beyond that where, you have to be in the upper middle class or above to opt into enjoying these technologies and the benefits of them? How do we get to the point where there's a very welcoming, helpful ramp for lots of folks to benefit from these technologies? And with that, I'm happy to pass it to my good friend Armand.
Thanks,
Thank you all
Director
for
Spots.
listening.
Appreciate it. So to continue building on this conversation about Seattle's work when considering autonomous technology, Seattle's been quite engaged in how to prepare for and consider the impacts of automated technology in our rights of way. In 2017, our department released the new mobility playbook, which had a specific call out to manage the technological and cultural shift to automated technology. Within that playbook, there is also Appendix C, which created a preliminary automated mobility policy framework that we've looked to as we continue our approach for managing our rights of way as automated technology arrives. In 2018, the Washington State Transportation Commission kicked off this group that we are now a part of. SDOT joined the executive committee in 2019. Also in 2019, NVIDIA published a video of their AV perception system operating in the city of Seattle. In 2021, Zoox, which is another AV company, notified SDOT that they would begin testing in Seattle. And now in 2023, as Director Spotts mentioned, Seattle and Bellevue released our collaborative autonomous vehicle strategic vision document, and we've issued our first permits under our AV testing program. Before we jump into our AV permit program, I wanted to touch on a topic that Director Spotts brought up, which is how the city and industry can show partnership and what this looks like in practice with some other examples of how cities manage our rights of way. And that is our shared mobility program, which includes shared scooter, bike, and car share. It's been a hugely successful program. In the 2022 to 2023 permit year, we've seen more than 4 million trips taken across these modes. And using data collected, we've been able to determine that car trips are being replaced by these devices. Seattle has a competitive permit program for our shared devices. So we currently have 4 vendors that operate. And because of our permit program, we're able to implement certain requirements that both help the vendors and help the city in providing a more robust transportation system. So we receive trip level data from our vendors, and using the heat maps generated from that trip level data, we're able to expand parking corrals and dedicated geofenced parking areas so that users know where to find and leave devices at the start and end of their trips. Also, based on trip level data, we're able to verify that vendors are deploying a minimum 10% of vehicles in equity areas. And actually, our vendors have gone above and beyond, and we're averaging 15% deployment in equity areas. We're also able to work with our vendors to do some exciting collaborations. One is the Bike and Scoot to Transit program, where if you take a shared mobility device to and from transit, you will receive credits to use towards future trips, which is very exciting. And we've also worked with our vendors to offer discounts to folks that are eligible for utility discounts or discounted transit. So we like to use our shared mobility program as an example of success in how we're able to partner with vendors using an established program to have a professional relationship with them rather than stepping to the sidelines. So now we'll talk about our AV testing permit program. So we have a set of requirements that are supplementary to the state's self-certification program. First of which is coverage of level 3 vehicles. The RCW only covers levels 4 and 5 vehicles, and I'll get into later why we cover level 3 vehicles. Additionally, we have a test driver requirement and the certification of a driver training program. The RCW is silent on a test driver requirement. However, the governor's executive order does allow for testing both with and without a driver. We also require a first responder interaction and disengagement plan, which is reviewed by our first responder partners at the Seattle Police and Fire Department. We also require that our AV vendors conduct a first responder demonstration event to show how to interact and disengage the vehicle should the test driver be incapacitated. We also require a minimum of 2 public outreach events that we work with our vendors on. And we have additional insurance requirements. So commercial general liability, automotive liability with higher per occurrence requirements and aggregate requirements. We also have technology, error and emissions coverage, cybersecurity coverage, employers liability and workers coverage as well. And then finally, we require that AV companies testing under our permit program indemnify the city as they continue to test. And this QR code will take you to our new mobility page where you can find a link to our strategic vision document and the AV testing permit program website. So I wanted to go back to the SDOT goals that Director Spots mentioned and how they relate to AV testing. So one of our goals is safety, which is that we believe everyone should be able to move safely throughout the city. In considering some of our requirements, we wanted to prioritize mobility and safety for the public as these driving systems are being developed and tested in our complex urban environment. Seattle has hills, it has multiple road users, we have bike lanes, we have a lot of action happening in our streets. And we understand that these driving systems are still being tested, which is why they're not fully fleshed out. And we want to make sure that the public can be assured that we're prioritizing safety. So that is why we require a test driver to be in the vehicles so that they can take over in the case that the driving system needs assistance or is unable to operate in a certain area. For mobility, we believe that transportation choices are critical to accessing opportunities. So we want to make sure that we're engaged with our AV vendors to understand how their future services will benefit the public and increase their transportation choices. As I mentioned previously with our shared devices program, we are engaged in very robust data sharing to verify that the devices are providing value and a real transportation choice for the public, and we hope to do the same with AVs. Excellence, we believe that we should exceed the expectations of the communities we serve. So, which is why we have required public outreach as part of our permit program. We also want to build public trust and engage with the communities, with the vendors, because we've seen in other markets with more sustained AV deployment that when there are issues, that can be really damaging to the public's trust of how the right-of-way is being managed and what these services might offer to them. So we want to continue being involved and have a seat at the table so that we can ensure that the services provide the highest level of trust for the public. So I'll just go over our permit process. We really intended for this process to be streamlined and a low burden for our interested AV companies. So the first step is an interested applicant submits our initial application form, which is a 3-page form that includes some certifications as well as descriptions of the vehicles, what their public outreach plan might be, and they include attachments for their first responder interaction plan. Once we receive that, we have staff that work in our new mobility team, including myself, that review the submission, and we coordinate with Seattle Police and Fire on the review of the first responder plan. Once we're satisfied with their submittal, the applicant formally applies for an SDOT Public Space Management Long-Term Use Permit, which is a renewable permit that's valid for 1 year. At that time, in that process, the vendor will also upload their insurance indemnification and other documents, which are then verified by our street use team. Once all the documents have been submitted and to a satisfactory level, then we administratively issue the permit. So it's as easy as that. And then once the permit is issued, we work with the vendors to deliver the first responder event and continue collaborating on their public outreach events. So now I'll just give a quick spotlight into our AV permittees in Seattle. We issued our first AV testing permit to Zoox. Zoox aims to provide mobility as a service ride hailing for users. So their future form will be a robo-taxi that's able to accommodate up to 4 passengers. And it has some exciting features like it's bi-directional. So that is Zoox. And then we have also issued a permit to NVIDIA Corporation. NVIDIA provides end-to-end platform for the transportation industry to develop autonomous vehicles. So they create sensors and hardware and software for other manufacturers to use to develop their own autonomous vehicles. NVIDIA is not in the market of providing a future ride-hailing service. And I will note that we're very excited to have issued permits to the 2 companies in Washington with active testing in the state. There is a 3rd company that's self-certified in the state, but currently has no active testing. And these 2 companies that we have tested have declared to us that they are testing level 3 vehicles, which are conditional automation vehicles. And this is why we were intentional to include coverage of level 3 vehicles in our permit program so that we're able to make sure that they are complying with the requirements of our program that they may not need to comply with at the state level because the state only covers levels 4 and 5 autonomy. So here's an example of our permit requirements in action. In May, we hosted a first responder demonstration event with Zooks at an SDOT facility. It was a great event, very well attended. We had about 40 staff from the Seattle Police and Fire Departments, as well as from our Seattle Department of Transportation Incident Response Team. The Zooks team gave a presentation on their vehicle, their automated driving system, and how their testing methodology is designed to interact with first responders and emergency situations. We then followed the presentation with a walk around of the test vehicle that they're using in Seattle, one of the test vehicles, I will note. And police and fire staff had plenty of opportunity to learn how to engage with the sensors, how to deal with the vehicle in the case of a collision, and the role that the test driver has as testing takes place. So again, this first responder event is a permit requirement, and we were very excited to have hosted this with Zooks last month. And then next, I'll just go over what we're looking towards in the future. So I mentioned our robust data sharing that we receive from our shared mobility partners, which includes scooter, bike, and car share. We receive that data through a standardized data specification called the Mobility Data Specification. It's maintained by a group called the Open Mobility Foundation, which is a consortium of cities and industry partners that works on the creation of common data standards. The Open Mobility Foundation recently released Mobility Data Specification 2.0, which includes passenger services such as TNCs and future AV rideshare. And the MDS is designed to allow vendors to provide data to cities in a way that is digestible and also anonymizes the data so that they can retain their competitive advantage. As I mentioned, for our shared mobility program, we currently have 4 permitted vendors, and they all compete with each other, but they're all also sharing data using the same data standard to the city so that we can continue to make informed decisions for our transportation system. The Open Mobility Foundation also maintains the curb data specification, which Director Spots mentioned, our SMART grant for curb access. As part of that SMART grant, Seattle will be translating our existing curb inventory into the curb data specification, which can be used by anyone. So any AV company is able to access this data in the future and know exactly granular information about our curb loading zones. The curb data specification also allows for vehicles that are occupying curb spaces to share data back on their occupation patterns and so on and so forth. So we're very excited to be a member of the Open Mobility Foundation and continue working on ways to effectively share data between private entities and the city. And I will pass it back to Director Spots for any closing comments.
Thank you, Armand. That was a great presentation, and thank you for your leadership. I just want to say that, we're really pleased to be part of this group, and I'm looking forward to the collaboration and would love to meet some of you in person. And I've actually never been in an autonomous vehicle and would love to have the opportunity with some of my staff to experience what that's like, as somebody mentioned earlier. So lots of good collaboration ahead. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share with you.
Thank you both, Greg and Armand. Are there questions or comments for Seattle DOT? You must have wowed them.
I think it's just a long meeting.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's more discussion regarding what we talked about earlier. So thank you so much for your presentation. We really appreciate it. Scott, I think we can go ahead and move forward.
Yes, coming back on here to share my screen. Just give me 1 second. Okay, so we wanted to wrap up. I was honestly thinking that this was in our first slide deck, or a little thrown there at the beginning, but we touched on this topic. Let's just jump into kind of the remaining work group meetings for the year. Just wanted to kind of close with that thought, and then Mr. Chair, we may go back to the previous discussion if we want. We're looking at a time frame in August. Really, kind of the cadence of the year is we're taking this input today, moving forward on the roadmap and outlining the final report, and looking to engage you all in the drafts of those and what that process is looking like here at the August meeting on August 22nd from 9 to noon. Then again in October, reviewing kind of those finalized documents and looking for a voting action from you at that point on the final roadmap and the work group final report that will close out for this work group. So those are our two remaining meetings. That's really what we're looking to do with those, really making those kind of engaged working meetings to make sure that we're capturing some meaningful recommendations and next step actions here for these documents. So I think with that, we are here are some just kind of closing items, important dates, but Mr. Chair, I think back to you for any open items from the executive committee.
Thank you so much, Scott. Appreciate the presentation. So we had a conversation going earlier and we stopped it in order to give Seattle DOT an opportunity to present. Anyone want to continue that discussion? And the floor is open. Yes, Ariel.
Hey, thanks. I really just wanted to say, in continuing that conversation, first of all, I very much appreciate all the comments and the context that was shared. Speaking on behalf of the industry association, we're very focused on having a collaborative discussion, but not just discussion, but work product and progress that can be made on a path to deployment. So I hope everyone realizes that whatever we can do to continue that work, all the feedback is very much welcome in not just the substance, but the process in which it can be undertaken. We welcome that, and so we're looking forward to it. I'll note just in the previous presentation, just on behalf of our members, we appreciate the work that Seattle DOT is undertaking that program. I think we've shared some of our comments and some concerns, but the reality is that a lot of hard work was put into that, and those permits were issued. And so as we continue to discuss some of the attendant issues that go along with a city level permit program, and we get into kind of legislative discussions that may touch on preemption, I just want to make sure that it's reflected that we appreciate the outreach that Armand and his team have done, and we look forward to continuing to engage with them and with everyone in this group, and we appreciate all of the work that's been put into it. That's sincere, that's genuine. We want to do that, and we believe that there really is a clear path forward for deployment, and we want to get there. You can sense the urgency. I'll just make one final point, and I alluded to it earlier, or maybe I said it earlier. It touches off on the reference to San Francisco earlier, and some of the issues that they've been seeing. I'll just note that, again, the backdrop here is a safety crisis that was mentioned. And one of the things that stands out from all of the data that's been submitted from AVs is, there's been several million miles of testing in San Francisco, or operation, I should say, with public passengers. The record is tremendous. And at the same time, we continue to see absolutely horrific numbers in crash fatalities and injuries. And so that urgency, I would just urge for it to be carried into the conversations when we think about deployment. There really is, every time an AV is deployed, whether in San Francisco and Phoenix or Texas or otherwise, we're not going to have that data point that it prevented a crash. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to put forward. But I think the data is starting to show that is taking place. And that urgency of saving people's lives and preventing injuries, I hope can percolate up through the conversation in a way that I'll just share. I'm not sure has been fully captured, and we're looking forward to continuing to do that. And again, really appreciate everyone's time.
Thank you, Ariel. Appreciate that. Representative Kloba.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate the comments that Mr. Wolf had there, and I think that that is an important thing. We all know, and we've heard, robot cars don't drive drunk, and robot car, there are a lot of behaviors that are human behaviors that they don't do. And at the same time, I think it is important to recognize that there are things that humans do that we do not yet have the capability to do with an AI kind of driver. So I think while we look at those sort of industry-wide or transportation system-wide in this country, the data on crashes, and I share his concerns that it seemed like during the pandemic, crashes went up. And that is, going the wrong way on all of our shared Vision Zero goals. But at the same time, we do see that there are some crashes where when you compare what the autonomous vehicle system, the decision it made in a given edge case is not the one that a reasonable human would have made. And we have to look at those two so that we have the balance and we're looking at the fullness of the picture. I do fully think that we can get to a place with autonomous vehicles that we are, the public is confident in them, and that we have vastly reduced crashes that cause injuries and fatalities. And that will be, that's a shared dream, I think, that we all have, but I think we need to make sure we're keeping our eyes open and being very realistic as well, because I know that we will get there.
Thank you, Representative Kloba. Ariel, you have your hand up?
No, I think it was from before. Thanks.
Oh, no worries. Other questions, comments? I'm not hearing anything. I'm not seeing any. Oh, yes, Armand.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to build on that conversation and also just reemphasize a point that we made earlier in our presentation, which is effective and useful data sharing. So Seattle maintains a inventory of our high injury roadways, where we see a higher disproportionate amount of incidents taking place. And something that we are concerned about is that AVs may arrive in areas that are already really flush with transportation options, and in the areas that are not necessarily where our high injury network is. And so I think that's a great way that we can collaborate with the industry if we're able to understand trip level data to know the impact that future AV deployment is having by making sure that they are deployed equitably across the city, particularly in locations along our high injury corridors. So that we're able to make sure that the benefits reach all users. I mentioned for our shared mobility program, we get trip level data and heat maps, and that's how we're able to verify equity area deployment. So I just wanted to throw it back to the importance of data sharing to make sure that we're meeting the outcomes that are shared among the industry and our transportation officials.
Thank you, Armand. Other questions or comments? I don't see anyone. Okay, so our next expectations for remaining 2023 work group meetings. Our next meeting will be August 22nd, 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. Pacific time. It's a virtual working session for a roadmap and working session for the final report. And then the next meeting is October 4th, 9 a.m. from 12 p.m. Review the finalized roadmap, review the work group final report outline. The voting action will be required to finalize the roadmap, deliverable, and work group final report outline. I know of no other business to come before the committee and would adjourn the meeting if there's no objection. Hearing, seeing no objection, so ordered. We are adjourned as of 1:50 p.m. Thank you, everyone. Hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.